I'm going to take you step by step through making the Peppermint Starlight Quilt. And the first step we do is to make half square triangles. And we're going to do that a little differently this time using 2.5-inch strips. Okay, we're ready to start sewing. So the first trick of sewing is you sew with right sides together. So obviously these are the right sides, the sides with the print on them. You can see the back of this one and the back of this one. The dots are there, but they're not as bright or as obvious. Some fabrics, it's very easy to tell right side, sometimes it's not. So you put those right sides facing one another, and you see those selvages. I'm making sure that I've got my selvages covered on both, because the worst thing to do is get a quilt square ready and to see a peep of that white showing up in your pretty red quilt square. So I've got my 2.5-inch strips, and I'm making sure they're together. If you want to be extra careful, or you're a brand new seamstress, you can use pins to put it together. Me, I just like to go at it. So I'm going to put this on that 1/4-inch line of tape that I laid out. And I'm going to drop my presser foot, and that's this little lever right here. Drop the presser foot and get my edges lined up nice right on the tape, and just go and do a 1/4-inch seam down the length of my fabric. And see, it's starting to get off a little, so I'm just going to move it into place. And there you go. And you have a 1/4-inch seam on your fabric. So I've got my stack of 2.5-inch strips sewn together. I've got a seam 1/4-inch on both sides. So what I'm going to do is just press each of these strips really well, and that sets these triangles out of this 2.5-inch strip of fabric. I'm going to take the 45-degree line on my ruler and lay it at the top of the 2.5-inch strip, and make sure I'm out of the selvages down here. And then I'm going to flip the ruler over so that the 45-degree line is at the bottom. Go to the top corner of this triangle, make sure I'm lined up here at the bottom of my 2.5-inch strip, and cut this off. And I need 8 triangles. Line of stitching just right there at the point that's going to have to come out, and that's a really simple pull. You just get a hold of it, pull it, and then you open, and there you have a about 3-inch half square triangle. When you finish cutting your triangles, you need to press them open. And to do that, you put the dark fabric on top. And I'm choosing green as the dark fabric. In this quilt, you always press to the darker fabric. So for me, I'm going to call green darker than red. So you put the dark fabric on top. I hit it with the iron. Then I open it up and press. And what that does is it pushes everything behind the dark. Because I'm squaring to 2.5, I'm going to use the 4.5-inch block. It has this rubber gripper in the center. And we always put the light side on top and the words on the light side. Words on the light side. And that rubber gripper catches on that 45-degree seam you made. So I slide it down. I'm squaring to 2.5, and I slide it down so that 2.5 is on the edge. And this one's pretty close to perfect. So I am going to cut this edge and the top. And then I'm just going to slide this sucker up and cut off that little dog ear. And I have a perfect 2.5-inch half square triangle. Now, that one was perfect. That means the next 15 won't be. But what we do is we slide down to closest to 2.5. And for this one, it's short at the top. So I'm going to stop right there. It leaves a little extra. Cut off my side and my top, And then I'm going to turn the whole thing 180 degrees. Slide it down, line up on my 2.5 inch line, and trim off just a little bit of excess. And it's not much. I mean, it's just little bitty crumbs, but it's enough to make the block sew together straight or not. And I'm just going to keep doing these and let you watch it in fast motion. When I'm laying out quite a few quilt blocks, I like to stack them so that then I can pin them. So this block is a pinwheel. So I'm going to start in the center. We'll get turned a half turn from the way the other. So you face it the same and then a half turn. Okay, so there's a pinwheel. And then what I'm going to do is take these blocks and match them up to their appropriate colors. And then as you can see, you just really need to think about each block to make sure you get it going the right direction. So that's what I'm doing, is putting everything in order. Now, there are 12 of these. So that's what I'm going to do, is get them stacked so they match. And I just take, now that I've got the layout done, I can just go on top of each one. Okay, so now I have my stacks of blocks laid out. So what I'm going to do is do my seams. So the first seam I'm going to be making is this one. So I flip this block over like this and like this. Then I'm going to pick these up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Making sure I only get 2, 7, and 8. So there are going to be 8 seams this first time around. And I am sewing down this side because that's where I flipped. So what I'm going to do, this is one whole block put together. I'm just going to put a pin there so I know to sew down that side. And then I'm going to do the same thing 12 more times. All my stacks ready to go. The pin is on the seam side and I am ready to sew. Okay, I'm going to be chain piecing these stacks I made where I put my pin on the seam side. So I'm just going to lay these on the bed of my sewing machine and take out the pin. Seam side is facing to my right. That's just how I organize things. Everybody else can do it their own way. So now I'm going to lay these 2 corners together and these 2 corners together. And if you're brand new at this, you might want to stick a pin in there. Just start seaming with a 1/4 inch. And there's a lot of thickness there, so I'm going to go slow to start. Make sure my bottom corner matches up and pull my pin. Okay, now I do that one and then pick up the next one, match up my corners. And I am just going to keep going through this pile and on to the next. And when I get done, I will have a chain of blocks. Oh, now I'm coming to a seam allowance that's sticking up. So it's wanting to push it the other way. I lift my presser foot and put it back down. And that way it doesn't push my seam allowance the wrong direction. This time, the seam allowance is on the bottom, and it's going to want to push it this way, so I just make sure it's facing the right direction. And here I go. And I'll check back in when I get done. There is something so satisfying about pulling out a long chain of piece squares. So I'm going to start at the end and start clipping these apart. I'm counting to keep my blocks together. There are 8, so there's 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and that's 1 block. Okay, so now I'm gonna press these open. So remember, first we set our seam, and what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna do the first 2 as they come off the stack. Get that out of my way. The second 2, turn them over, and this is so their seams will nest when they get sewn together. So I turned it over, so it has to go like this. Turn it over. Third 2, the way they come off this. And then the last 2 get flipped over as they come off the stack. So after I've done this, what I'm going to do, I'm going to clear a space over here and lay out this block. Now this is the same as what I did before. I match up the corners. Now on this I can't nest the seams because I pressed toward both the green and the red. So with those I line them up as best possible because we do want our seams to be good. If you want to throw a pin in, that's a good place to put your pin. Right there where that corner comes together. Now this one, I can nest my seams. You press toward the dark one, but both the red and the green are dark, so I just made the conscious effort to always press toward the green. And that way I knew that it would come out so that mostly they would nest. Also, I did it that way so my block, when I was squaring my half square triangles, I would know which side to put the block lock on. And that's one of those bulky where they're both going the same direction because they aren't pressed into the white. And so my machine has a hard time cruising through that thickness. Okay, there's 1 block. And I'll just keep going. So we got through this block, which is excellent. It's a great stopping place. So I'm going to go ahead and cut these apart. 2, 3, now it's 4. Last time it was 8 when we put those together. So now I've got piles of 4 equals a block. I'm going to lay out each block, pin it, next block. Here we go. I press the first one the way it comes off the stack. second one gets turned upside down. And you can see all the seam allowances are running this direction, which is opposite the way those are going. Third one, the way it comes off the stack. And the fourth one upside down. Okay, here we have a block. Okay, so each strip is sewn together. So the way now we're going to sew it are these seams. This one comes down like this, and this one comes down like this. And this is why we're so particular about pressing. Now, I really want these to match up. So what I'm going to do is now is when I'm going to use pins. I'm only going to pin this center one, and I'll do the others by feel, but I really want my centers to match up. And then as I feed them through the machine, I'll make sure that this seam nests and this seam nests. And you can really see the nesting here. One goes this way, one goes this way. Put the seams together until they feel nice and flat, and do your sewing. Okay. Okay, we've assembled our lines of 4 patches, and we are ready to do the second to the last seam on this block. How cool is that? So remember, I put the pin in the center, and now I'm going to go through and match this seam and get it nice and nested and match my corner and start sewing. Now checking that nested seam as I go along. Checking my center seam that has the pin. Gonna pull the pin right before I get it. You don't want to hit a pin with a needle. It's a good way to break a needle or dull a needle. Okay, nesting that third seam. Doing a good press while they're still folded together, and then opening them up. Really doesn't matter which direction my seam goes, just as long as it's nice and flat. Got a little bit of bulk right there in the middle, but my points came together really nicely. So we're going to fold this over. I'm going to stick a pin in that middle seam like I did with the last one. Still nesting really nicely. And there is one ready to go. Let's get this last seam made. They're not quite finished because they do get a 2.5-inch border in the white around them, but the hard part's about done. Okay, cutting these apart to get them pressed out. Yay. And you guys can see what this block looks like. Okay, and I'm gonna cut these strings from the first one. All this, so many strings. Let's get this nice and flat. And look at that. Isn't that gorgeous? I love the way that the pinwheel is outlined in the circle, and then once we get the white around it, it's just going to be a beautiful little block. So it's going to be about a nice size throw when we get finished. Quilting is a lot of little fiddly details, but the end result is so rewarding because you just get something that makes you smile. Now, I've done this as a Christmas present, and it looks, to me, it looks like candy, but you could choose to do it in any color. I mean, spring colors, even fall colors would be pretty. Or just something to match your house. We love throws at my house because my husband really loves the air conditioning. And so always like a good throw to keep us nice and toasty. Okay, it's time to add the borders to our blocks. I have got 2.5-inch strips of the white. I'm going to unfold that, and I'm going to chain piece the stars to that. So I'm going to take my pile of stars and put them here. And what I'm going to do are the sides first. And I'm considering the sides the parts where my long seams are. The sides go down those. So I'm going to lay my block, missing the selvage, on top of my white strip or my background strip. And get her started, just put one little stitch in there to hold it in place. And then make sure my fabric is even. And I just chose to do this the hard way first. All of the seams that point up facing that, but this way I can watch those seams and make sure that I'm getting them down well and not flipping the direction of them. Okay, just get my next block, get it in there. I want to make sure I leave enough space to cut these apart and give it room. So I'm giving it about, oh, 1/2 inch, not quite a 1/2 inch. I'd like to be able to get 5 stars to a strip. That's the plan. I don't want to put too much of a gap between them, because remember, our yard is, give or take, 42 inches width of fabric, and each of my blocks is 8 inches. So I don't have a whole lot of room. That first stitch I take is called an anchor stitch, and it just holds the two pieces together, and then you can adjust after that one's down. Is it gonna fit? This is number 5, and it sure is, with plenty of room to spare. So I know on the next one I can take even a little more gap if I want to, without worrying about it. Okay, so I've got a strip attached to one side of my blocks. I got 5 down each strip. Now I'm just going to go and attach another strip to the opposite side. This is opposite to pressing to the dark. I'm pressing to the light, but it's because there's going to be less bulk if I press this way, because there's just the one seam on one side, but there's the multiple seams on the other. So it just will be less chunky. And I want to get these pressed first before I cut them apart, because there's nothing worse than cutting them apart and finding out you've shorted one of your blocks a little at the edge. That has happened to me. So what I'm going to do is line up this edge and cut off those ends. And do the same thing with the next block. Pull him down a little bit, line up this edge. And cut off those ends. And so on. And line it up to the block, because I wasn't measuring how far apart I put these, so they're different width apart. So kind of to the seam here, and the seams through the block is what I'm lining up against. And I'm going to take them and turn them the opposite direction and do the left side. When I first started quilting, I didn't know about squaring. Squaring was something that I've learned after spending some time with some really good quilters, because my first quilts, one side was longer than the other. They were definitely not rectangles or squares, they were polygons. They were crooked, but still made with love. So squaring is something that's really important if you want it to be even. Okay, so I'm going to show you how to square a block. So what you do to square up your blocks is first you take all your blocks and find the smallest one. And my smallest block was 11 inches even. So we are going to square to 5.5. That's the center. So my handy ruler with its high-tech sticker that tells me where the top right is. And I'm going to find the 5.5 line here and the 5.5 line here and put that in the center of my star. And line it up as best I can vertically and horizontally with my angle line, doing the best it can, and going to 11 inches even. Okay, and yes, that is going to work. So here we go. Top and side, and then I go in and turn this a full 180. Put my 5.5 line in the center again, and if I did it right, this outside line should line up on the 11 line, and it does. So now I just cut off the excess. Side and top. And now I have a perfectly square 11-inch block. And I'm going to do that to all 12 of my blocks. It is a 12.5-inch ruler. It is marked every 1/4 of an inch with hash marks at the 1/8 of an inch. This is a great ruler. I use this when I'm making t-shirt quilts. I use it for squaring all my blocks. Ooh, this in the comments. We call this whole process quilting, but what we've been doing so far is actually piecing. Quilting is sewing together the 3 layers: backing, batting, and top. You can hand sew it, takes forever, I've done it, or you can machine sew it, or you can pay a long arm operator to do it. And back in the old days, batting wasn't in the local Walmart. They used old quilts, old clothes, pieces of fabric that couldn't be reused for anything else. And the batting layer is what creates the warmth in a quilt. So I've squared my blocks to 11 by 11. So I want my batting and my backing to be 1 inch bigger, so 12 by 12. I like to make my quilt sandwiches on the ironing board so I can get them nice and flat. So I take my background, and it is facing away from me, so the good side is facing the ironing board. And I give it a really good press. Then I take my batting, and I am using 80% cotton, 20% polyester batting. This is my favorite kind of batting to use because it is affordable, and yet it has a really good weight. And I take my block, and I lay it on there, and I make sure that there's fabric on all 4 sides, because that would be bad. And then I press it really good. Slide it along to press the batting as I press the block. Now, I'm going to use a really high-tech method to put this together using old-fashioned safety pins. And I'm going to put those on the 4 corners, not all the way to the edge. I'm going to check the back and make sure it's nice and straight, and it is. Now this is a quilt sandwich ready for quilting. The first thing I'm going to do to quilt this block is straight line sewing. And the first thing I'm going to do is stitch in the ditch around my star. And all that means is to put a seam line where the 2 fabrics come together, or the ditch. And if I do it right, you won't see the stitches at all because they'll be buried in that little crevice there. So I'm going to do that first. I like a curved edge scissor to cut my threads just so I can get nice and close and not have razor stubble. Now, I've gone around the star. I'm going to go around the circle. When I end, I like to take a back stitch just so I don't get any unraveling. And you have just straight line stitched in the ditch a quilt square. You could literally stop there. So the first free motioning I'm going to do is in my white space, and I'm going to do what's called loops and swirls. And it is one of the easiest free motion patterns. So all it is making loops and swirls. And you don't need to block it out. You don't need the design to follow. It's very random. My one goal is to not cross thread lines. Sometimes I do anyway. Okay, here we go. Put down your presser foot and let's go. Oh, I do like to cut this thread because it gets threaded through all the stitching and is almost impossible to get out. So I do pre-cut that. So there's my first loop and a swirl. And as you see, I am slowly moving the fabric with my hands. And I take my swirls in both directions. And all I'm doing is filling all this negative white space with loops and swirls. When I stop to readjust, I make sure I get my needle into a needle down position so that I know that my stitch is going to be in the same place, because with the free motion, you can get a little off. The biggest trick to free motioning is your stitch length, trying to keep it consistent. A great way to practice free motion is writing your name in stitches. Just get yourself a quilt sandwich of scrap fabric and use a different tone thread because that'll help you see your stitches, and just write in cursive. You've been doing that all your life. My first free motion quilt was song lyrics. I have written Grammy Loves You and quilts for my grandkids. I put prayers in quilts, Bible verses, things like that. Writing is a great way to start free motioning. Have fun, enjoy, because if it's not fun, it's not worth doing. Free motion design I'm using on my star points is what I consider a shell pattern. And I usually do this freehand, but I'm going to draw it out just so you can see what I'm going to do. So the first thing I do is I make a little teardrop at the bottom, come back up, make the loop back down, and they get bigger as I go up and I get wider. So do you see how it kind of looks like a shell, which is why I call it a shell pattern. And as my pen goes, so will my thread go. So I am, like I said, drawing this on just to show you what I'm going to do with the machine. But this shell pattern I've already done on the red, and I'm just going to finish out on the green. When I free motion, I like to use a thread that is a similar color to what the back of the fabric is. So I used red on my red, and I don't know if you can see the shell pattern here. So I used red on this, and I'm going to use green thread on this. So the mom tip for free motioning is watch your posture, because I have been free motioning all day, and the point between my shoulder blades is killing me because I forget to keep my shoulders back. So I'm going to take just a little bite, take a few stitches, and then I'm going to lift my presser foot and cut this thread because I don't want that woven into all these stitches. So like I said, I normally do this freehand, so I probably won't stay right on my pen lines. Nope, not even close. but those are there more for reference in this situation than they are for perfection. Now, sometimes you need to be a little more perfect than others. Then I just go in and trim, and I'm going to do that on all 4 points. And when I get done, I will trim the back, and this block will be done. I originally squared the blocks to 11 inches, but the free motion, the quilting, can actually make them draw up a little, and they did. So I'm going to square them all to 10.5. So I make sure my ruler has the 1 by 1 at the top right corner, because I'm right-handed and that works best for me. I'm going to 10.5, so half of 10.5 is 5 1/4. So I put the 5 1/4 line down the center of the block and the 5 1/4 line on the horizon center of the block. And that block is actually pretty square, so I'm going to put it just like that and take off this little bit of an edge. And then turn it, line it up on the 10.5 line down here, lined up on the 10.5 and the 10.5, and just take off this little bit. And not all of them drew up, but some of them did, and we want all the blocks to be a consistent size. The secret behind my start to finish quilts is the quilt-as-you-go method. I'm going to show you how to join already quilted blocks. And we have the 1 3/4 inch strip that we had, and the 1 1/8 inch strip that we cut. And I'm going to use that on my first block. So I take the 1 3/4 and I've pressed it in half with the wrong sides together. I lay that piece on the top, and I take the 1 1/8 strip and I put the right side against the back. And I'm going to put a 1/4 inch seam along this line. Okay, I've sewn the folded strip to the front and the flat strip to the back, 1 3/4, 1 1/8, and I've pressed the back strip open. So what I'm going to do now is flip over the second block and put the first block on top of it. Now I've got my backings facing each other, and I'm going to line those up top and bottom, and I will sew a 1/4 inch seam through the 1 1/8 strip and the block. And I've got, like I said, my blocks lined up top and bottom. Okay, so I've done my entire first row. I've got 2 sewn together, 2 sewn together, pressed open. Now I'm going to take the second, turn it upside down, first on top. Once again, match up top and bottom. Get that up there on that edge. I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch here. First row is sewn together. So now I've pressed the top folded piece over, and what I'm going to do is fold it over, make sure I'm covering that seam line, and top stitch right on the edge. And top stitching is just taking a seam right on the edge of that piece. I'm going to use some pins to pin that to make sure it's covering the seam line, and then I will top stitch it. You can see I have top stitched along this edge on each of these. So this is my first row quilt as you go. I'll go on and do the rest of the rows like this. So I've attached the 1 3/4 folded in half and the 1 1/8 single to the bottom of the first row. Now I'm going to take the second row, and it will go like this. So I'm going to turn it upside down, and I'm going to lay this on top of it like this. Now I need to match up where these lines are so that those are even. So what I do is start in the middle and put that line on top of its partner and put a binding clip there. And I go and do that with every line. So I want to make sure the line here and the line here match up. And then it's the same down at the bottom. I also want to make sure that my edges match up over here. I'll throw another binding clip at the end. So my edges match up here with a binding clip. One more time, making this line match this line. So I'm laying the edges together. Making sure it matches down at the back side as well. And throw a binding clip. You could also use a pin. And then I'm going to make sure that these edges match up. And put another binding clip. I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch seam starting at the top. And just put a 1/4 inch seam cap. Now I'm going to join the third section to the two together, same way by marking those seams, flipping it so that my backs are facing one another, matching up this in each section and binder clipping it here. Now the mom tip for this: when putting a quilt together, don't just keep adding rows. Do half and half, and then join your two halves together so you're only having to deal with the bulk of the full-size quilt one time. And the body of this quilt is done. All it needs is borders and binding. You make your borders just like any other quilt sandwich. So you start with your backing, press it really nicely. Add your batting on top, and I made my backing and my batting a 1/2 inch bigger than my front. And then put your front piece on, making sure that it's centered in the border, and press very well. And if you notice, right side of this fabric is up, right side of that fabric is up. So the right sides are facing to the outside. And then I'm going to use my safety pins. Put one on the end. And then I'm going to just slip one down each side, staggering them to hold this nice and tight in place. For the design on this border, I'm doing a grid placement, and I'm making my lines 4 inches apart, and using my friction erasable pen, I am marking those lines so that diamonds set on point. Okay, I've made my grids with my 4 inches apart, and I am going to sew along those lines. Okay, now that I'm at the end, I'm going to go to the edge, other edge, and sew down. A few stitches, and then I'm going to use the side of my presser foot Okay, I've gone down both sides, and you see how it is a very simple pattern, but kind of a Grecian knot. So now I'm going to hit it with my hot iron to get rid of my markings. Is that not the coolest thing you've ever seen? And I'll just go down and do this. Okay, once I have all my lines pressed, I'm going to take my scissors and trim the excess backing and batting. Once I have that done, I'll attach to the right and left side using the same method I did to attach my blocks with the Quilt-as-you-go, with the folded 1 3/4 inch peppermint candy. And for this one, I'm going to switch it up a little bit, and for the 1 1/8, I'm going to use the polka dot on the back, just to give some interest to the back, so it's not completely candy cane. Attached my side border using the Quilt-as-you-go method with the candy cane in the front and the polka dot in the back. So I've done both sides, and now it's time to do the top and the bottom. I am going to pin all the way down, just because I need it to match on both edges. So I'm going to go to this one, put my clip here, and out here on the end, and I'm going to make sure it matches up in the middle. I've extended my table to have a place for the quilt to rest. I've been known to throw a ironing board over here or a chair, just something to hold the weight of the quilt while I'm working. So the first free motioning I'm going to do is in my white space, and I'm going to do what's called loops and swirls. And it is one of the easiest free motion patterns. So all it is making loops and swirls. And you don't need to block it out. You don't need the design to follow. It's very random. My one goal is to not cross thread lines. Sometimes I do anyway. Okay, here we go. Put down your presser foot and let's go. Oh, I do like to cut this thread because it gets threaded through all the stitching and is almost impossible to get out. So I do pre-cut that. So there's my first loop and a swirl. And as you see, I am slowly moving the fabric with my hands. And I take my swirls in both directions. And all I'm doing is filling all this negative white space with loops and swirls. When I stop to readjust, I make sure I get my needle into a needle down position so that I know that my stitch is going to be in the same place, because with the free motion you can get a little off. The biggest trick to free motioning is your stitch length, trying to keep it consistent. A great way to practice free motion is writing your name in stitches. Just get yourself a quilt sandwich of scrap fabric and use a different tone thread, because that'll help you see your stitches, and just write in cursive. You've been doing that all your life. My first free motion quilt was song lyrics. I have written Grammy Loves You and quilts for my grandkids. I put prayers in quilts, Bible verses, things like that. Writing is a great way to start free motioning. Have fun, enjoy, because if it's not fun, it's not worth doing. To make binding, you join your 2.5 inch strips at an angle. So you put the selvages beyond the seam, and then so like this, and then sew from corner to corner. And we do this to reduce bulk, because this is going to be folded in half, and to have 2 seams next to each other would be so bulky. So I've done that. I take this strip and turn it over and add the next piece to it. Going past my selvages so they're out of the seam allowance. And once again, sew corner to corner. And I continue this for all my binding strips. Once I've sewn all these together, I go in and trim off the excess to 1/4 inch. Now I take these to the ironing board, press my seams flat, and then I'm going to fold it in half with right sides out. When attaching the binding, if you're going to machine top stitch it down, you sew it to the back first. If you're going to hand stitch it down, you sew it to the front first. But honestly, I don't have time for hand stitching, so I am going to machine top stitch it. So you start with your piece, leave a tail. That's to join it. And I start at the bottom, about halfway down the quilt. And I just sew it on with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. When you come to the corner, stop a 1/4 inch from the edge. Turn your quilt 45 degrees and do a stitch straight off the corner. And that will help with your mitered corners. So can you see? I took a stitch straight off the corner. So now I'm going to take this binding, I'm going to fold it on that angled line I just made and bring it up to the top so that I've got a squared fold on the top of this corner. And then I continue sewing 1/4 inch down the other side. I do this all the way around until I get back to the bottom, and I'm going to leave about a 10-inch gap at the bottom to join. I'll be back to show you how to join. I have my binding sewn to my border, and I've left a gap. I'm going to use my ruler and measure that gap. And my gap is right at 9.5. So half of 9.5 is 4 3/4. So I'm going to put a pin at 4 3/4. And I'm going to come and bring one tail over. And from that pin, I'm going to measure 1 1/4. So half of the 2.5 that the binding is. So 1 1/4. Be very careful that you're only cutting the binding and not the quilt. Done that. It's not fun. So 1 1/4. I'm going to make a snip, and then I'm going to cut it perpendicular to the edge. Do the same thing with the other tail. Bring it to your pin. Measure over 1 1/4. Make a snip. And then cut perpendicular to the edge. Okay, so to join this, I'm now going to take and open this up. And I know that I want the bottom layer to be attached to the bottom layer. So I'm going to do it like this, bottom layer to bottom layer. So I'm going to stick it right there like that. Throw a pin in that corner. Pin this edge. Make sure you leave yourself enough tail that you've got room to work in here. And then I'm going to pin this edge. And I'm going to make a diagonal seam from here to here. Okay, I've made my diagonal seam from this corner to this corner, right through here. Mom tip, test it before you trim it. Fold it in half, make sure it's straight. There have been times where I have twisted these around. You do not want to trim it if you've done that. Okay, so mine matches up nicely. I'm gonna come up, trim to a 1/4 inch seam allowance above that line. I'm gonna finger press that, and that just means using my finger to press that seam open. Then I'm gonna fold it in half, and I will continue my 1/4 inch seam to finish my binding. My binding is attached all the way around to the back, and now I'm going to bring it forward. Make sure I'm covering this stitching line. Fold it, and then I'm going to use a pin or a binding clip to hold it in place. So a binding clip like that, or a pin like this. Either way, I'm holding it in place. That is the only place I pin other than the corners. And to miter the corner, I'm going to pull this fabric around. Since I'm starting sewing from this side, I'll be coming in this way, so that piece will go on the bottom, cover the line, then take this side and bring it over and cover the line. And a very experienced quilter told me that you will never get more than 4 perfect mitered corners, and they will never be on the same quilt. But you try your best and you just manipulate with it until you get a decent miter. So there you go, and I'll put a clip. And you can also attach this with pins if you don't have any binding clips. So I'll put one in front of it, one after it to hold it in place, and move on to the next and do all 4 of my corners. So what I'm going to do is do a very close top stitch, very close to the edge, right along this fold, making sure to cover this stitching line, making sure anything frayed stays inside the binding, and just put a seam all the way around the quilt. And then it will be finished. I talked to you about hand stitching binding. You can go in with needle and thread and sew this down, but really ain't nobody got time for that. Have a great day. Enjoy your quilt.